differently, Florence might be the capital of the state. It was originally a town separate from Omaha and had a bid-in to be named state capital. Can you imagine how differently the community might have looked if that had actually happened? Florence and its surrounding North Omaha area was originally inhabited by the Indians, then later by the Mormons, or the Church of the Latter-day Saints. It was developed, its first development was called Winter Quarters, and it was developed by James Comley Mitchell. When we look at history, we'll recognize many names associated with Nebraska that all started in the Florence area. Some of the surrounding areas include Menalusa, North Florence Boulevard, Belvedere Point, and Miller Park, just to name a few. This used to be the hottest part of the city, and now we see a lot of history and a lot of devastation. And right here I kind of have a map, and it shows all the different, I'll let you look at it if you guys want later, all the different parts of the city and what they're named. So we can take a look at that. I'll pass it around here in a minute. Prior to North Omaha, and specifically Florence being developed, it was inhabited by the Pawnee, the Oto, and the Sioux Indians. When they originally came, the Mormons wanted a place as they were heading west to settle down just for the winter. Between 1846 and 1847, so that they could settle down in one of the areas. The location was actually just up the street from here. It was at the corner of Young and Mormon Bridge Road, and it was called Cutler Park. They set up their town square and everything. After several months of getting it ready, or about 6 weeks, there was an issue, and they were actually in the wrong land, so they had to move after they had started to build their city. They moved it closer to the river, so it's over a little bit closer to the Mormon Bridge, and it ran southwest from there. It's weird because when you look at all the information and you put it in the concept of today where things are located, Florence was considered not what we consider it here. It was actually a much larger area. They've even included the Leo Vaughn home, which used to be the old Florence old folks home, which is on Fontenelle Boulevard, and that's quite a ways away. So I don't think of that as Florence, but that was still considered the Florence area back in that time. So the reason the Mormons stopped here is because they had to bunker down for winter. They stayed through the winter. There was a lot of sickness, and people were not ready for how harsh it would be, so many didn't survive. What they ended up doing in the spring is, due to how many deaths there were, they buried those folks, which is now the Mormon Cemetery, which is just right up the street. And depending on what book you read or what website you're looking at, one says that Brigham Young, who was here, went and continued on west to find a location while the rest of his group stayed here. Another story says that they all left in the spring together. So I'm not sure which one's more accurate, but we'll go with the one that he left, and then he came back after he found a location in Utah, and then his whole group left. They basically abandoned what was known as Winter Quarters, and it was pretty much a fully functional city and all the buildings, and they just took off and left it all there. After being abandoned, James Comley Mitchell, which I had mentioned before, came from Iowa. He was newly married and he hadn't really settled there. He heard from Peter Sarpy that there was this city, but it was abandoned, so he decided to come over here. Once he arrived, he mapped out and plotted what is known as Florence. He worked very hard at establishing the community and becoming a real productive part, having part in legislation, fur trading, different things like that. He's the one who actually put the bid in for Florence to be the capital of Nebraska. It was kind of a tug of war between Florence and Omaha, and it ended up about 1854, it was named Nebraska Territory, and I don't have the exact date, but the capital was then, the bid was put to Lincoln, and that's where it stayed, and that's where it is today. In 1917, Florence was then annexed by Omaha. Not only was Florence affected by the growth of Omaha, but so were all the other communities around it. I kind of have a tough time calling them towns because I think of them as sections of our city right now. And the distinctive cities or towns were Saratoga, Briggs, DeBolt, Benson, and East Omaha. DeBolt was considered, and it was named after a family over by where Springfield School is, that area, and closer to 72nd. Saratoga is east, and then Benson is quite farther away. But it was weird because none of those were considered Omaha at the time. They were all their own entities. Saratoga was established the same year as Omaha, and it was considered a rival city. It even boasted a dock on the river called Sulphur Springs. It had a school called West Saratoga. You may know it today as Central Park. And one piece of Saratoga that means something to me is my alma mater. It was home of Brownell Hall, which later moved and is Brownell Talbot by Memorial Park today. And DeBolt, again, was north of Forest Lawn Cemetery. It had its own school, which is Springville. I don't know if it's probably not obviously the exact school, but that's the area it was in. They also had a church and a post office. Briggs was not anything more really than a stopover between Omaha and Fort Calhoun. And Benson was originally known as Benson Gardens. It was found by Eustace Benson in Clifton, Maine. Benson was a banker and a land speculator. His end game was to basically buy this land, create this ideal image of a town, and then sell it to turn a profit. I kind of found that funny because today there are TV shows about flipping properties, and it's big business. To think back then in the 1800s, that's also what they were trying to do. Benson flourished and has remained a distinctive area today. And then as Omaha continued to grow, all these areas were annexed to form a bigger city. Most have lost their identity, except for Florence and Benson have remained strong communities. Florence still boasts the old mill, which I have here. We all know that's right by OJ's, and it's on the corner of Collins Boulevard. So I find that interesting because it is believed that Brigham Young contributed to building that mill, which seems, I don't know, kind of crazy. And then Florence also has its post office, which still remains here. It was established in 1856. And the Florence Depot, the toll booth from the Mormon Bridge, which when it was originally built, there was a toll there to help cover the cost. Once the costs were paid off for the bridge, they moved the toll booth, and it still sits in Florence today. We talked about Leo Vaughan Manor, which is on Fontenelle Boulevard. And then, I don't really think of Florence Boulevard as being part of, or Fontenelle Boulevard as being part of Florence, but it was back in that time. One thing that I haven't mentioned that I think is a big part of Florence is Florence Boulevard. It's one of the most beautiful scenic roads in all of Omaha, and it was once dubbed the prettiest mile in the city. It was designed by Horace Cleveland, and its intent was to connect Miller Park and Omaha at the time. It hosts grand homes that were owned by Charles Martin, State Senator Edward Burke, and George H. Kelly. He was the president of a manufacturing company. Today some of these homes are run down, but there's still many that people live in that have refurbished that are still beautiful. Florence has been on the upswing the past several years, and they're putting a lot of money into the community. Not only are there new businesses, they would work hard to maintain its old charm and to keep its original things there as much as possible. Several years ago, the park on 30th and State was updated with a new playground, new green area. The roads are lined with drains now that circulate water into the ground to help the plants that they're putting in. so we kind of know where we're headed. Our state and our community are so rich in history, and I don't think we realize when you go through it, and some of the stuff that I learned when I was researching this are amazing, because a lot of the streets are named after people that were part of building everything here, and you don't think anything about it. I briefly touched on the history of Florence, and it's something that if you really look into it, it could go on for days. I found it fascinating, and I hope that at least through this you've learned a little bit about the community you live in.